Now we'll move on to the intervention part of this functional assessment and intervention course. First, we'll cover proactive interventions, treatments that involve manipulation of environmental variables before the target behavior has the chance to occur. A large part of antecedent interventions involve motivating operations. As a review, motivating operations are antecedent variables that momentarily alter the value of a consequence, that is, they establish or abolish its value, and alter the frequency of responses that have produced that consequence in the past, that is, they evoke or abate behavior. We say that these effects are momentary because they change over time and are not permanent. So, during an antecedent intervention, we may want to eliminate the establishing operation that we have found to evoke the target behavior. We create an abolishing operation, perhaps through satiation by non-contingent reinforcement, or elimination of whatever is making a demand aversive. Some environmental manipulations are more difficult to label, but still do involve motivating operations. For example, you could alter the relative value of one consequence by increasing the value of another through pairing. You could also increase a behavior's response effort, thus essentially making it not worth it to engage in that behavior based on what reinforcement it's contacted in the past. Let's discuss non-contingent reinforcement first. Non-contingent reinforcement is a proactive antecedent intervention in which a given stimulus is provided on a time schedule. That schedule could be fixed or variable, or continuous if it's a stimulus that can be constantly available. Some things that could be continuously available are music, videos, or toys. Stimuli that are more likely to be delivered on a fixed or variable time schedule include vocal or physical attention or breaks from activities. The assigned reading reviews the difference between default and function-based interventions. It's noted that non-contingent reinforcement often delivers stimuli that have been found to maintain the target behavior, but non-contingent reinforcement can use stimuli that are selected more arbitrarily as well. If a target behavior is maintained by attention, a function-based version of non-contingent reinforcement would be delivery of that attention on a time schedule. An arbitrary version could be delivery of toys on a continuous schedule. Note that while function-based interventions are more likely to be reliably effective, there are ways to help make arbitrary interventions more effective as well, and we'll review this in class. The goal of proactive interventions, including NCR, are to prevent the behavior from happening in the first place. In order to accomplish this, in the case of NCR, we must create an effective abolishing operation. For example, we must create enough satiation to decrease the value of engaging in the behavior, or provide enough breaks from aversive stimulation to eliminate its chance of evoking the behavior. A continuous schedule of NCR obviously has the best chance of abating the target behavior, but there are downsides to this. Since antecedent interventions are only temporary in their effects, as soon as you stop, the behavior is likely to occur again. To help with this, you must fade out the intervention gradually. Fading out from a continuous schedule will take a very long time. Your fading will take less time and be more efficient if your starting schedule is based on baseline data of the behavior. One option is to base your schedule on the rate or inter-response time during baseline. If the shortest or average amount of time between instances of the behavior is 5 minutes, you could deliver non-contingent reinforcement about every 4.5 minutes in order to prevent the behavior from occurring. You could also base your schedule on the latency to the first occurrence of the behavior during baseline observations. If you see that the behavior only begins to occur after 10 minutes of attention deprivation, again, you should be sure to deliver attention non-contingently somewhat more often than every 10 minutes. Again, since it's unlikely that you can keep an antecedent intervention in place forever, at least not on a very dense schedule, you must eventually but gradually fade it out. There's no tried and true rule about how to change a schedule of non-contingent reinforcement. The only important point across the board is to do it systematically. This means that your changes should be data-based. Only change the schedule if you've observed that your current schedule has been successful in preventing the occurrence of the behavior. You should see steady state responding at low to zero occurrence of the behavior before either decreasing the delivery of non-contingent reinforcement or increasing the presentation of aversive demands. Then you would wait again to see that steady state responding before making further changes. One option to improve the effectiveness during fading is to increase the duration or magnitude of non-contingent reinforcement while you're decreasing how often you deliver it. For example, you could start out by giving a 5-minute break every 10 minutes of work. Then you could work up to giving a 30-minute break after every hour of work. We've already talked about a couple of limitations to this type of intervention. Its effects tend to only be temporary, lasting until the antecedents are no longer being manipulated. In order to increase the likelihood of the effects being more long-lasting, you need to fade out the intervention, which can be time-consuming. Another concern with NCR is that, since you're delivering a reinforcing stimulus on a time schedule, regardless of what behavior is occurring, there's a chance that you may accidentally reinforce an undesirable behavior. However, this effect has never been demonstrated in the published literature. If you're worried about it, you can use differential reinforcement of other behavior, which we'll discuss in the next module. Another concern is simply that this intervention is not practical in some environments. If you're using a non-contingent schedule of attention every 10 minutes, you might not be able to do that while you're out to see a movie in a theater or while you're on an important phone call. If you find that it would be effective to give 10-minute breaks from work every 5 minutes, that might not be feasible in all classes at school. Again, you'll want to fade out these dense schedules to be more feasible across environments, but it can be difficult to even start with something like a continuous schedule, depending on the client's setting. In your assigned reading, Lally et al. Noted that dense schedules of NCR are more effective than thin schedules. Again, this makes sense. A dense schedule of NCR is more likely to create satiation and abolish the occurrence of behavior. The purpose of this article was to demonstrate the benefits of selecting a schedule of NCR based on baseline data. That it's easier and faster to thin from an efficient schedule in comparison to an arbitrarily dense schedule, and that on the other side of that coin, a database schedule will be more effective as an abolishing operation than an arbitrarily thin schedule. Lally et al. Had another question as well. Is it necessary to combine NCR with extinction? We'll discuss extinction in great detail in a couple of modules, but can touch upon it now as well. Keep in mind that while we're starting out by discussing each of these interventions in isolation, ultimately you'll almost always use a treatment package with several interventions in combination. We're focusing on proactive interventions now, but a good treatment package includes a proactive intervention that you implement in order to decrease the likelihood of a behavior, a reactive intervention that governs what you'll do if the behavior does occur, and an intervention to teach a replacement behavior. On page 135, the authors state that NCR may attenuate the state of deprivation rather than eliminate it. This means that the behavior can still occur even if you're trying to abolish it. So, extinction may be a good intervention to add to NCR as a reactive intervention. You ensure that the behavior isn't reinforced if it does occur despite NCR. You've had a fair amount of experience reading empirical articles in this course now, so we can fade back a bit and discuss the studies as a whole rather than going point by point. If you ever have trouble interpreting an article, I encourage you to use the summary form that we've reviewed in the past. Try to identify the experimental question, the dependent variable, the basic course of the methods, etc. There were 3 phases in this study. In the first phase, the authors conducted functional analyses. When testing the effectiveness of a function-based intervention, you of course need to determine the function of the behavior first. In this case, it was demonstrated that all 3 participants' behaviors were maintained by access to tangibles. Thus, those tangibles were delivered non-contingently in the intervention. In phase 2, Donnie and Tony experienced a combination of NCR and extinction. NCR is intended to prevent the behavior from occurring in the first place, but if the behavior did occur, it was extinguished. That is, the reinforcer that was found to maintain it previously was no longer delivered contingent on that behavior. In phase 3, the third participant, Harry, experienced NCR alone without extinction. In this case, if the target behavior occurred, the participant did get access to reinforcement. Here are the graphs of Donnie's and Harry's results from the study. In Donnie's case, aggression occurred a little less often than once per minute during baseline. Then, a combination of NCR and extinction was implemented, and the behavior decreased in level. The return to baseline showed an increase in level, verifying that the previous reduction was indeed due to the intervention. So, the intervention was reintroduced, with another decrease in level to 0 occurrences of the behavior. This is replication. The little numbers above data points indicate the schedule of NCR. The first schedule was delivery of NCR every 90 seconds. After a few sessions, this was faded to 120 seconds, then 150 seconds, etc. When the schedule was thinned to 240 seconds, you can see that the rate of behavior increased somewhat. The authors waited for 2 sessions of the behavior being eliminated to then thin the schedule to 270 seconds. But this led to a large increase in rate, to 1.6 instances of the behavior per minute. So we know that NCR was no longer effective in abolishing the behavior at this point. Why then did it gradually decrease in rate by session 45? Extinction. When the behavior did occur, it was not reinforced, so it stopped occurring. As the schedule was further thinned at this point, the behavior never occurred until parent training began, so the combination of NCR and extinction was certainly effective. Now let's look at Harry's graph. Only NCR was used with Harry, not extinction, but it was still fairly effective. Note, though, that the schedule was faded to provision of NCR every 300 seconds, or 5 minutes. As discussed, this may not be feasible to implement in all settings, and would need to be faded quite a bit more eventually. We don't know for certain whether or not NCR alone would be effective at a thinner schedule in this case. There were, of course, many more interventions reviewed in the assigned reading. We've already reviewed non-contingent reinforcement, so let's briefly discuss the other function-based interventions as well. First, stimulus control strategies. As pointed out in the assigned reading, alteration of stimulus control, that is, discriminative stimuli and S deltas, necessarily also includes manipulation of consequences. If behavior is maintained by access to attention, and I put up a stop sign that I want to use to signal that attention is not available, I first have to change the consequences in the presence of that stop sign. Typically, that involves extinction. When behavior occurs in the presence of the stop sign, I don't reinforce it. Ultimately, the addition of the stop sign is a proactive intervention in the sense that I want to prevent the behavior from happening in its presence, but it does involve reactive components as well. The next broad category of function-based interventions in the assigned reading is interventions designed for behaviors maintained by escape from aversive stimuli. You could eliminate the aversive stimulus entirely, then gradually increase its presence just as you would gradually thin a schedule of non-contingent positive reinforcement. You could also alter the aversive stimulus or its context in order to make it less aversive. In the case of academic demands, by offering help with the activity, giving more breaks, allowing choice of order in which to complete the demands, etc. The assigned reading categorizes the high probability request sequence under the previous topic, but it's different enough that I've separated it out here. In this case, you're essentially attempting to prevent the problem behavior maintained by escape from demands by making compliance with those demands more valuable. To do this, you reinforce compliance with easier or less aversive demands. While this does involve reinforcement, a consequence manipulation, you're implementing this intervention before the target behavior occurs in an effort to prevent it, so it is proactive. We'll discuss each of these interventions in class, and we'll practice both describing them and identifying when they're described. As previously noted, while we've been emphasizing functional behavior assessment followed by function-based intervention, sometimes default or arbitrary interventions are necessary and can still be effective if they're well planned. In the case of each intervention discussed in the assigned reading, be sure to become familiar with the strengths and limitations. In what cases should these interventions be used or avoided? Why? You should never select an intervention simply because it's the one that you're most familiar with or because it's worked in the past with another client. You should consider the function of the behavior, the goals with regards to reducing that behavior and likely teaching a new one, how immediate the effects will be, how restrictive the intervention is, the environment in which the intervention is being implemented, how likely it is that the intervention will be implemented with good treatment integrity, the likelihood of maintenance and generalization, and many more variables. Here are the default or arbitrary interventions discussed in the assigned reading. If you don't feel confident in briefly describing the methods of these interventions, along with at least one strength and limitation, I encourage you to review. We'll practice with a quiz game in class. As we're now getting into the intervention side of this course, it's a good time for you to start considering what interventions you'd like to include in your behavior intervention plan, based on the function you identified for the target behavior and the context in which you'll be intervening.